Southwest Wales is a region shaped by the constant relationship between land and sea. There, the Atlantic not only delimits the territory, but defines it. The tides advance and recede with enough force to reshape the landscape over the centuries, while extensive stretches of sand, shifting dunes, and coastal forest areas create a scenery that alternates between openness and isolation. It is a part of the country known for its natural beauty, its tranquility, and the feeling of being away from the modern urban rhythm. Within this context lies the region of Pembrey, located a few kilometers from ancient merchant cities and historic trade routes. The name is now often associated with wide beaches, wooded trails, and recreational areas frequented by families and hikers. The horizon is low, the terrain gentle, and vegetation covers much of the land with an appearance of continuity and balance. At first glance, nothing suggests tension. The environment conveys stability, as if it had always been that way. However, this tranquility is recent when compared to the long history of the place. The Pembrey area was occupied by human groups long before written records. Archaeological evidence indicates a continuous presence for over 2,000 years. Fragments of pottery, traces of primitive dwellings, and defensive structures point to a region that was contested, not just inhabited. Ancient peoples established settlements there for clear reasons: access to the sea, natural routes of movement, and abundant resources. These same advantages, however, made the area strategic during periods of conflict. Throughout the Iron Age, natural elevations were transformed into fortified points. Later, with the Norman expansion, castles and checkpoints emerged, reinforcing territorial control and coastal surveillance. Each new structure did not completely replace the previous one, it was superimposed upon it. Thus, the land began to accumulate layers of occupation linked not only to survival, but also to defense and control. The Pembrey coast also has a direct connection to maritime violence. For centuries, the Welsh coastline was part of trade and military routes. Frequent storms, unpredictable currents, and shifting sandbanks made navigation risky. Historical records and occasional finds indicate numerous shipwrecks along this stretch of coastline. In some cases, the sea exposed the remains of vessels long after they had been declared lost. Merchant ships, military vessels, and supply ships disappeared there, taking entire crews with them. During times of war, this stretch of coast gained even greater importance. During internal British conflicts and European disputes, Southwest Wales was seen both as a supply route and as a vulnerable point for invasion. There were times when the possibility of enemy landings was considered real. In response, coastal defenses were reinforced and surveillance increased. Even when direct combat did not materialize, a state of constant alert was part of the local routine. This prolonged history of tension has shaped the human relationship with the territory. The landscape was not merely observed or contemplated. It was used, contested, and repeatedly adapted for strategic purposes. Each generation left physical and symbolic marks. Some are visible, such as ruins and ancient layouts. Others remain only as historical records or subtle alterations in the use of space. Over the centuries, nature has reclaimed much of these marks. Forests have expanded over previously open areas. Dunes have advanced and receded, concealing structures and vestiges. Modern trails cross ancient paths without revealing their origin. This process of natural recomposition has contributed to the current appearance of serenity. However, it has not erased the past. It has merely integrated it into the landscape. Today, visitors to Pembrey find an environment that seems designed for relaxation. The predominant sounds are those of the wind and the sea. The forests offer shade and shelter. The dunes soften the transition between land and water. Everything suggests continuity and stability. Yet, this scenery rests upon a territory that was, for long periods, the scene of conflict, loss, and extreme human endeavor. Pembrey's historical weight lies not in a single event, but in its repetition. Successive occupations, prolonged conflicts, maritime accidents, and military uses over the centuries have transformed the place into a space of accumulation. There was no clear moment of closure or definitive break with this past. The region simply changed its function, maintaining its natural structures while human activities adapted to new demands. It is this contrast that defines Pembrey, a place where the current calm does not eliminate the historical density. Tranquility does not negate what came before. It exists above it. The territory carries memory not through explicit monuments, but through the sum of human uses, disputes, and losses that have concentrated there over time. Before any other element is considered, Pembrey needs to be understood as this: a seemingly simple space shaped by centuries of intense interaction between nature, strategy, and human violence. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Pembrey territory entered a new phase in its history. The landscape that for centuries had served as a route, natural defense, and strategic border became directly integrated into the logic of industrial warfare. It was no longer just a matter of monitoring the coastline or protecting maritime access, but of producing, storing, and moving war materiel on a continuous scale. The transformation was profound and permanent, the installation of what would become known as Royal Ordnance Factory. This change was decisively marked. The location was chosen for practical reasons: relative isolation, access to the sea, ample terrain naturally protected by dunes and forests. These same characteristics that previously favored settlements and defenses began to justify high-risk activities. The distance from urban areas reduced the public impact of possible accidents. The silence in the terrain helped to conceal the scale of what was happening there. With the progression of World War I, munitions production ceased to be episodic and became constant. Large quantities of explosives, projectiles, and components were manufactured and stored daily. The work routine involved unstable materials, sensitive processes, and minimal margins for error. Men and women worked surrounded by substances that could become fatal in seconds. The natural landscape was interrupted by functional buildings, concrete depots, and internal railway lines, created to transport dangerous cargo to shipping points. Accidents soon began to occur. Industrial explosions struck workers during regular shifts, often without warning. Some incidents resulted in immediate deaths. Others left serious injuries that did not last long. In certain cases, the violence of the explosion was so intense that identifying the victims became impossible. These events were not treated as exceptions, but as inherent risks of the activity. Reports were filed, structures repaired, and work continued. After a brief period of reduced activity following the end of the First World War, the site regained strategic importance with the outbreak of the Second World War. The Royal Ordnance Factory was expanded and integrated into an even more complex production and logistics system. The Pembrey area began operating at an accelerated pace, meeting the demands of a global conflict. The constant flow of explosive materials increased the pressure on workers and facilities, also raising the risk of new accidents. In parallel, the creation and expansion of RAF Pembrey, the military use of the region, was consolidated. The airfield was established to meet the needs of coastal defense and training operations. Combat and support aircraft began to use the airspace regularly. Patrol missions, escorts, and armed exercises became part of daily life. The sky, like the ground, became a high-risk environment. Not all flights returned safely. Air accidents occurred during training and operations, some involving human error, others linked to the technical limitations of the time. There were losses of aircraft and crews, both on land and at sea. Each crash reinforced the association of the territory with death linked to the war effort, even when there was no direct confrontation with the enemy. For decades, the combined operation of the weapons factory and the air base transformed Pembrey into a permanently tense space. Nature remained present, but subordinated. Forests were crisscrossed by railway tracks. Dunes protected explosive depots. Ancient paths gave way to service roads. The territory began to absorb physical and human impacts continuously, accumulating episodes of loss that were rarely publicly discussed. With the end of the major conflicts of the 20th century, activities were gradually reduced. Munitions production continued for some time, but lost relevance. Eventually, the facilities were closed. Unlike other industrial or military sites, Pembrey did not undergo a comprehensive redevelopment process. There was no clear transformation that gave new meaning to the site. The buildings were abandoned. The bunkers remained. The marks of intense use were left exposed to the elements. Abandonment did not mean neutralization. Structures designed to contain explosions began to deteriorate. Rails rusted. Empty warehouses continued to occupy the space, now without a defined function. The territory once again appeared natural, but it carried a concrete legacy of risk, death, and destruction systematically produced throughout the 20th century. Thus, Pembrey ceased to be merely a historically strategic space and became a local symbol of the industrialization of war. Not because of battles fought there, but because of the continuous production of the means of destruction and the lives lost in that process. The territory was shaped to sustain human violence in an organized, repetitive, and functional way. This legacy did not disappear with the closure of the facilities. It remained inscribed in the space, creating a material and historical basis that would continue to influence everything that came after. When the Pembrey military installations were abandoned, the territory entered an undefined period. The structures remained where they had always been, but without a clear function. The bunkers, once controlled and monitored, became merely concrete volumes scattered throughout the forest. Rusty rails disappeared under the vegetation. The space, once restricted, became accessible. It was in this interval between military use and civilian normalization that the first direct contacts between ordinary people and the physical vestiges of industrial warfare emerged. In the mid-1990s, Jacob Binion was a local student, still a teenager, interested in history and exploration. He and a friend used to cycle through Pembrey Forest, following old paths and stretches of what remained of the internal railway that connected the ammunition depots to the coast. For them, the place didn't carry a definite aura of danger. It was an abandoned, sparsely frequented space that aroused curiosity because of its scale and silence. On one of these visits, they decided to explore the area with a simple goal: to record the location of the bunkers still visible for a school project. They arrived in the morning, on a clear and warm day. The air was still, and the distant sound of the sea drifted unevenly through the forest. They left their bicycles in an open spot and began to walk, with paper and pencil, noting what they found. The first bunkers emerged partially covered by vegetation. Some had exposed entrances, others were almost hidden by earth and roots. The structures varied in size and shape, but all shared the same worn appearance. Jacob noted positions, outlines, and general conditions. The process was methodical and calm. After documenting a few points, the friend commented that Jacob avoided entering the bunkers. There was no outward fear, just hesitation. After some insistence, Jacob agreed to enter one of the closest structures, while his friend stayed outside, watching the bicycles. The entrance was a dark recess embedded in an earthen ravine. A few stone steps led inside. As soon as he descended, Jacob noticed a clear change in temperature. The air was colder and heavier. The interior space was larger than it appeared from the outside, forming a wide chamber with a low ceiling and bare concrete walls. The silence was profound. Right from the first steps, an unusual odor emerged. Initially faint, it became more noticeable as he moved forward. The first association was with a dead animal, something expected in an abandoned place. However, the smell wasn't organic. It seemed dry, rough, with a characteristic reminiscent of burnt material or old chemical residue. The longer he remained there, the harder it was to ignore. Jacob used a simple flashlight. The beam of light swept across the walls, revealing dark stains, signs of water infiltration, and uneven wear. There were no objects, only the aged concrete. At a certain point, the light stopped on something different. On the wall opposite the entrance, about halfway up, there was a dark mark, standing out from the other stains. He approached slowly. The shape became more defined as the distance decreased. It wasn't a random stain. It was the clear impression of a human hand, as if it had been pressed against the still, damp wall. The color was dark, between brown and dry red, with small lines indicating dripping before drying. Jacob brought his hand to his face, trying to block the smell, while observing the mark in silence. At that moment, the sensation changed abruptly. Without warning, the environment seemed to heat up intensely. Jacob would later recount that the heat didn't come from a specific point, but seemed to envelop him completely. The light from the flashlight became irrelevant in the face of an intense brightness that filled the space for a few moments. Looking at himself, he had the immediate conviction that his body was on fire. He described the sensation of pain as direct and physical. It wasn't anticipated fear, but an immediate perception of burning. The fabric of his clothes seemed to melt, revealing blackened skin. The pain was continuous, without pause. Jacob screamed and recoiled wildly, losing his balance and falling to the concrete floor. He rolled instinctively, trying to erase what he believed was happening at that moment. In a state of panic, he dropped the flashlight on the ground and crawled towards the exit. He climbed the steps with difficulty, using his hands and knees. Upon reaching the outside, he left the bunker screaming, hitting his arms and legs as if trying to escape invisible flames. Outside, the friend watched the scene in disbelief. He saw Jacob emerge in obvious despair, screaming and struggling, before collapsing to the ground. There was no fire, there was no smoke. Yet the reaction was intense and real. The friend remained motionless for a few seconds, unsure how to react. After a while, Jacob's breathing began to slow. He cautiously opened his eyes. The heat had subsided. The pain was gone. His clothes were intact. There was no sign of burns on his skin. Still, his body trembled. and the strange smell seemed to still linger in the air around the bunker entrance. Jacob tried to explain what he had felt. The words came out in fragments, but the essential point was clear. He believed he was burning, and the experience had been total. Neither of them considered the possibility of returning inside the structure. The flashlight remained where it had fallen. The unfinished map was abandoned. They took their bicycles and left the area without looking back. Jacob never returned to that place. Over the years, he sought information about the history of the facility. He discovered records of fatal explosions at the old weapons factory, including accidents in which workers died in extreme circumstances involving intense fire and bodily destruction. For him, the experience inside the bunker became linked to these events, even without a clear explanation. This episode marked an important transition in Pembrey's history. For the first time, the legacy of the Industrial War ceased to be merely a historical fact and began to manifest itself as a direct human experience, lived by someone who had no connection to that past. The territory, previously described by structures and numbers, began to be associated with sensations, physical reactions, and memories that were difficult to organize. From that point on, Pembrey's history would no longer be just about what happened there, but would begin to include what was still being experienced by those who approached its vestiges. After Jacob Binian's incident, Pembrey ceased to be merely a collection of ruins for those who lived in the region. The forest remained open, the trails continued to receive visitors, and the concrete remains stayed where they had always been. Even so, the case circulated discreetly, recounted cautiously, usually among people who already knew the history of the old military complex. What was most striking was not the idea of a mystery, but the sensory description, the unusual smell, the intense heat, the real panic. These were concrete details enough to disturb those who listened. Over the years, Jacob's account did not stand alone. Other stories began to emerge, separated by time and context, but united by specific points that consistently repeated themselves. They were not always the same people, nor the same times, nor the same paths. Sometimes they were local residents. Other times they were visitors unfamiliar with the region. In common, there was a recurring impression. In certain areas near the ruins and bunkers, some individuals claimed to have encountered something human, fleeting and difficult to explain, always accompanied by signs that evoked fire, burning, and sudden disappearance. In the summer of 2006, Gareth Hughes, a local man, decided to walk with his teenage daughter, Rianne, along quieter trails in the forest park. It was late afternoon. The weather was pleasant, and the light was beginning to change, without becoming dark. They chose a less busy route that approached areas where the remains of the old factory were still visible among the trees. They chatted casually, without expecting to find anything out of the ordinary. At one point, Rianne noticed a figure ahead, walking slowly in the same direction. The distance didn't allow for immediate details, and the two assumed it was just another visitor. The person's pace seemed heavy, with short, steady steps, like someone tired or uncomfortable. Gareth and Rianne continued walking, gradually closing the distance. As they got closer, their perception changed. Gareth later described the figure's clothing as appearing damaged, with dark, uneven patches like burnt or very worn fabric. The outline of the arms and hands seemed darkened, with the appearance of injured skin or skin covered in soot. The person walked with their head slightly tilted, showing no hurry, without looking around. Gareth called out, asking if everything was all right. There was no answer. The silence was complete. The figure neither accelerated nor stopped. It simply continued on its way. Rianne reported that for a moment, she had the impression that the head moved slightly, as if it had heard, but without paying real attention. The lack of reaction was the first thing that made them uncomfortable. Father and daughter quickened their pace. The trail curved gently, and as they rounded it, the figure was no longer there. There was no immediate fork in the path. There wasn't dense enough cover for someone to hide in seconds. The stretch ahead was relatively open, with low vegetation and spaced-out trees. They stopped, looked around, and tried to locate the person. They saw nothing. The disappearance was too quick to seem like a simple departure. The second striking detail was the air. Gareth stated that, in that same location, he smelled the distinct odor, like burnt wood mixed with something more aggressive, similar to chemical residue. Rianne confirmed perceiving the same smell. It wasn't smoke, there was no visible fire, but the odor lingered long enough to be clearly noticeable. For Gareth, this impression made it difficult to reduce the encounter to a simple mistake. He spent some time trying to imagine explanations. Someone injured, someone wearing old clothes, someone trying to provoke fear. However, the hypotheses didn't fit the rapid disappearance and the absolute silence. Gareth didn't turn the episode into a public narrative. He commented on it only a few times, usually with acquaintances who had already heard local rumors about the area. He avoided making any definitive statements. Still, he maintained the same practical conclusion. To him, it didn't seem like a typical encounter with a visitor, and both he and his daughter stopped frequenting that specific stretch of trail. What makes this account relevant is not only what was seen, but how it fits with other accounts that began to circulate with similar descriptions. Hikers who traveled along paths near the ruins mentioned, in different years, seeing a darkened figure among the trees, always at a certain distance, as if never allowing complete approach. The description varied between a man in rags and someone with scarred skin, but the pattern repeated itself. It appeared, walked silently, and disappeared when observed closely. In several versions, there was a recurring sensory detail, the smell. Some people described it as burnt fabric. Others spoke of the smell of something burning from the inside, a dry, irritating impression. The odor wasn't constant in the forest. It didn't appear on every walk, but it was vividly remembered by those who claimed to have seen the figure. This point in itself increased the feeling of recurrence, because the smell didn't depend solely on light or visual interpretation. It was something that could be perceived physically. A forest ranger who worked in the region decades earlier reported hearing, in the late 1970s, the testimony of two cyclists who claimed to have encountered a man staggering among the trees, appearing severely injured and with an impression of smoke or heat around his body. According to the record made at the time, the presence lasted only a few seconds. The most striking thing, in the cyclist's account, was the feeling of proximity. They said they were close enough to smell burning clothes before the figure disappeared from sight. Years later, in the late 1990s, a visiting photographer in Cardiff claimed to have taken pictures of a bunker covered in moss and vegetation. Upon reviewing the photos at home, he noticed that one of the images appeared to contain, partially hidden by a tree trunk, the upper outline of a darkened man, as if he were behind the tree. According to the photographer, this figure was not present in other photos taken in sequence, just seconds apart. He also stated that no one was nearby at the time he took the picture. The account offered no conclusive proof, but it reinforced a common aspect. The apparition did not persist. It appeared in a short interval, in which the person did not have time to confirm what they were seeing. Over time, these stories began to be repeated in a fragmented way. Some turned into rumors. Others remained as personal accounts told only to acquaintances. What maintained coherence among them was the repetition of three elements: the image of a figure with burn marks, the presence of an odor related to burning, and the sudden way in which everything ended, without gradual transition. It's not a matter of claiming that these accounts have the same cause, but of observing that the way they are described creates a sense of pattern, and patterns, when they emerge in a specific place, tend to alter how people perceive that place. Jacob's experience, years earlier, had already shown an important point. In Pembrey, contact with the vestiges of the Industrial War could generate something more than historical interest. The case of Gareth and Rhiannon, along with the stories of hikers, cyclists, photographers, and forest workers, suggested that this was not an isolated memory. Even without a definite explanation, the collection of accounts began to outline a simple and unsettling idea. Certain areas of the territory seemed to repeatedly produce encounters marked by signs linked to fire and destruction, and the more these similarities were noted, the more difficult it became to treat each episode as a completely independent event. Up to that point, the accounts associated with Pembrey Forest shared a relatively clear central theme. They spoke of human figures, signs linked to burns, smells reminiscent of fire, and sudden disappearances. Even without explanation, there was an internal coherence. The descriptions seemed to originate from the same type of setting: trails near industrial remains, bunker areas, and old paths where the 20th century past was still visible in the concrete. However, in the early 2000s, a different type of occurrence emerged, more difficult to fit into any direct reference to what had been the factory or the airbase. It wasn't a man. It didn't appear to be an injured person. There was no sign of clothing, uniform, or a known human body. It was something that, for those who saw it, imposed itself as another category. Colin Jenkins and David Evans worked for the local forestry service. Their routine was practical and repetitive: inspecting trails, removing fallen branches, checking for erosion near the dunes, and maintaining restricted access areas. For this reason, they knew the terrain and the natural patterns of the place well. They could identify the presence of deer, foxes, badgers, and domestic animals that sometimes entered the woods. They had enough experience to distinguish ordinary shadows from real movements. And perhaps for this reason, what they reported later was described carefully, without exaggeration, but with a certainty that is difficult to ignore. It was an autumn afternoon, the light already dimmed, but still bright. The two were sent to a less frequented area, about a mile from the park's main parking lot. The path was narrow, surrounded by dense conifers, and in some sections it turned into a trail marked by ruts, the result of water and the passage of maintenance vehicles over many years. They walked on foot, carrying tools, careful of the ground and the sides, looking for signs of recent damage. After about 20 minutes, Evans noticed movement ahead, at the edge of the path. At first glance, he assumed it was a large dog. The area receives visitors with animals, and the idea didn't seem strange. But as they moved forward, the shape didn't fit that of a quadruped. The body seemed too tall. The posture wasn't that of an animal on 4 legs, and the movement, even if brief, suggested balance in an upright position. When they were close enough to observe clearly, the two claimed to have seen a figure approximately 2 meters tall. The body structure was robust and covered in thick, dark fur, not like a fluffy garment, but like a continuous covering. The arms appeared long, hanging below the hips, approaching knee level. The torso was broad, and the head had an unusual shape, more elongated than expected for a human being, with a narrow snout or a muzzle-like projection. The most striking detail, reported by both, was the presence of 2 projections on top of the head, like short horns or raised bony structures. The figure didn't run. It showed no surprise. It simply remained there, partially off the path, as if it had stopped to observe. Jenkins and Evans slowed down, without needing to coordinate. Their behavior was instinctive, to continue walking, but cautiously, keeping their distance, and trying to understand what they were seeing. There were no shouts, no direct communication with the creature. The situation unfolded in silence. After a few seconds, the figure moved. It turned slowly and crossed the path toward the vegetation on the opposite side. The movement was described as controlled, unhurried, as if it were not fleeing. It entered the trees and quickly disappeared, swallowed by the shadow of the conifers. The two advanced to the point where she had crossed. They searched for marks on the ground, broken branches, any trace that would confirm the passage of a body of that size. They found nothing obvious. The ground seemed largely undisturbed. The vegetation showed no clear signs of movement. There was no specific odor in the air, no residual noise, only the normal silence of the forest. They continued their work, but in a state of heightened awareness. For almost an hour, they performed their tasks in silence, keeping their gaze fixed on the edges of the path and the dark interior of the woods. The forest at that moment seemed less stable, not because the place had changed, but because their perception had changed. When a familiar space produces an event that doesn't fit, everything else begins to seem more uncertain. It was during this period that the second, even more unsettling moment occurred. Evans stopped suddenly and pointed to an area among the trees, a few meters ahead. There was the same figure, partially hidden, motionless, as if observing the two of them again. The distance was sufficient to prevent fine details, but the general shape and height were consistent with what they had seen before. The fact that it was still, without any evident movement, intensified the impression that it was no ordinary animal. There was, at least in their interpretation, a component of directed attention. After a few seconds, they decided to end their shift, not out of explicit panic, but from a practical assessment. Continuing to work in that state of constant vigilance would increase the risk of accidents with tools and falls on the uneven terrain. They packed what they could and left the rest to retrieve later. They returned the same way, without talking much, avoiding looking into the woods for extended periods. In the following days, they did not officially report what had happened. The main reason, according to them, was simple. They didn't want to be treated as people who had mistaken an animal for something imaginary. Silence for a while seemed the easiest option. Still, the episode didn't fade. For Evans, the memory persisted, mainly because he couldn't find a simple explanation that fit all the details. Upright posture, long arms, elongated head, horn-like projections, and absence of tracks. Sometime later, Evans began searching for similar accounts in the United Kingdom. He wasn't looking for proof, but patterns. It was in this process that he found references to the case known as Hexham Heads, which had occurred decades earlier in northern England. This episode involved stone objects unearthed by children, and, subsequently, reports of a figure described by a neighbor as a tall, dark being with a hybrid appearance and projections on its head. What caught Evans' attention was not the explanation proposed by other people, but the descriptive similarity: an upright body, animal-like features on the skull, and a silent, observant presence. From that point on, Jenkins and Evans' account began to be mentioned in local conversation slowly and irregularly. Some people said they had seen something large moving among the trees during times of low traffic. Others described a tall, dark shape that crossed trails and disappeared too quickly to be identified. Some attributed it to common misunderstandings, such as partially visible deer or shadows in poor light conditions. But the core of the original account remained. Two workers familiar with the environment claimed to have seen something that did not behave like the known fauna. In certain traditions of British folklore, ancient forests are associated with boundary figures, not exactly human nor animal, often described as guardians, observers, or presences that appear in isolated places. These narratives have existed for centuries and vary from region to region. Mentioning this type of reference does not resolve what Jenkins and Evans said they saw, but it shows how, in territories with many historical layers, human interpretation tends to seek ancient parallels when a direct explanation is lacking. Pembrey, by its very history, offers this kind of symbolic terrain. It is a place where nature overlaps with ruins, where war structures remain within a forest used by visitors, where the past has not been entirely erased nor fully explained. The relative isolation, the sparsely frequented spaces, and the presence of dense vegetation create conditions for brief encounters that are difficult to confirm. At the same time, the accumulation of local stories, both old and recent, influences how people describe their experiences. Jenkins and Evans' account broadened the scope of what was being discussed about Pembrey Forest. It shifted the focus from occurrences that seemed linked to human memory and industrial trauma to something that wasn't directly connected to workers, explosions, or uniforms. It introduced the idea that the territory, in addition to preserving signs of what was produced there, could also generate narratives that escape the logic of those traces. What exactly was seen that afternoon remains unclear. There is no material evidence, no official record, no firm conclusion. What remains is the structure of the account: an encounter in broad daylight, in an isolated area, with a figure who showed no aggression, did not flee in a typical way, left no clear traces, and reappeared only to observe. In a territory already marked by layers of history and human loss, this occurrence opened a new question, broader and more difficult to answer. If Pembrey has already accumulated so much concrete human violence, what else might have been absorbed by this space over time, without a simple language to describe it? With the accumulation of accounts over the years, Pembrey has come to be observed from two perspectives that rarely coexist comfortably. On one hand, the human need to understand, classify, and explain. On the other, the persistence of details that escape any single interpretation. The attempt to bring all these experiences together into a coherent narrative inevitably leads to diverse hypotheses, some solid, others merely intuitive, none capable of encompassing the complete set of facts. In Jacob Binian's case, many pointed to psychological factors. A teenager in a closed, dimly lit environment, surrounded by ruins associated with war, could have reacted to intense sensory stimuli in an extreme way. The unusual odor inside the bunker, possibly caused by old residue, mold, or organic decay, could have triggered acute panic. States of deep anxiety are capable of producing real physical sensations, including heat, pain, and disorientation. Still, this explanation does not completely eliminate the impact of the experience, nor does it explain why the episode was accompanied by such specific elements linked to fire and burns in a place marked by real industrial accidents. Other accounts, such as that of Gareth Hughes and his daughter, have often been associated with visual illusions. The forest, at certain times, produces irregular shadows, contrasts of light, and incomplete shapes. The human tendency to recognize patterns, especially human figures, can transform ambiguous stimuli into clear images. The sudden disappearance could be explained by rapid changes in the angle of vision or by the varying density of the vegetation. However, this line of reasoning encounters difficulties when considering the repetition of non-visual sensory elements, such as the persistent odor of burnt material, perceived by more than one person at the same time. Attempts at a natural explanation also extend to Jenkins and Evans's account. Animals seen in unusual, partially hidden positions may appear larger or stranger than they actually are. A deer standing erect for a few moments, a large dog, or even an unknown animal observed briefly could cause confusion. However, this hypothesis loses strength in the face of the consistent description of the prolonged upright posture, the shape of the head, the horn-like projections, and the absence of clear tracks, especially considering the two men's familiarity with the local fauna. There are also broader environmental explanations. Pembrey is a territory where soil, vegetation, and human structures interact in complex ways. Ancient chemical residues, still present in the subsoil or on the walls of the bunkers, can produce specific odors under certain temperature and humidity conditions. Muffled sounds, pressure changes, and even unexpected physical sensations can occur in enclosed and abandoned environments. These possibilities help to understand parts of what has been reported, but they do not explain why different people, at different times, describe similar sensations in specific locations. The history of the place also weighs heavily on any attempt at interpretation. For decades, the territory was subjected to explosions, fatal accidents, and high-risk activities. Workers died there abruptly, often without public recognition. Planes crashed, cargo detonated, structures failed. This kind of past creates a collective psychological context. Even people without detailed knowledge of local history can be affected by the atmosphere of a space marked by ruin and abandonment. Memory doesn't need to be conscious to influence perception. Some, inevitably, resorted to explanations that transcend the rational realm. The idea that traumatic experiences could leave non-physical marks on the environment appears in different cultures and historical periods. Concepts such as residues, impressions, or presences are used to try to name that which does not easily fit into material explanations. Similarly, references to British folklore emerge when modern accounts echo ancient descriptions of observant figures associated with forests and border territories. These narratives offer no proof, but they show how, in the face of the unknown, the human mind seeks parallels in stories that span generations. The central problem lies not in choosing one of these explanations, but in realizing that each one only solves part of the picture. The psychological hypothesis explains the panic, but not the sensory recurrence. The environmental one explains the odors, but not the described apparitions. The natural one explains occasional mistakes, but not the consistency of certain details. The historical one provides context, but not direct answers. The supernatural one offers symbolic meaning, but lacks verification. It is in this space between incomplete explanations that Pembrey remains, a territory where the past does not manifest itself as a closed narrative, but as layers that continue to interact with the present. The ruins do not speak, but neither do they fade away. The worn concrete, the vegetation-covered tracks, and the empty bunkers remain as silent structures, without a clear function, but laden with historical significance. Perhaps the greatest discomfort lies precisely in this silence. Places associated with intense human suffering rarely offer closure. There is no ceremony that completely concludes what was experienced there. Nature covers it, time wears it away, but it doesn't resolve anything. The memory of the place persists not as an organized recollection, but as a potential for impact, activated when someone gets too close to its hidden layers. Living with Pembrey means accepting this ambiguity, walking along tranquil paths knowing that, beneath your feet, lie stories of production, risk, and death, recognizing that rational explanations are necessary and valuable, but that they don't always capture all the details, admitting that the unknown doesn't need to be dramatized to be unsettling. In the end, Pembrey demands neither belief nor disbelief. It simply remains a space where the past has not been fully absorbed, where human trauma has left visible and invisible marks, and where the silence of the ruins continues to coexist with unanswered questions. Perhaps that is what makes the place so difficult to ignore, not what is said about it, but what remains suspended between what can be explained and what simply remains nameless. If you want to continue exploring stories like this, where memory, territory, and the unknown meet in silence, follow the channel, Midnight Stories, and subscribe. Other narratives await, on the same border between what we know and what remains hidden.